Hello. We're continuing on our stories of David and the lessons we've learned. And so far, David has taught us so many lessons. We've learned from David that we were created by God. He created us and gave us a destiny and a purpose. We know that coming under authority means serving. Timing and location, well, they're both key factors to either promote, delay, or stop our destiny. Personal integrity, being the same, inside and outside, all the time. And then, as David was in a life and death battle, he knew then that he had to apply life lessons that he'd already learned. Well, today, we're going to look at a new lesson, and it's one that David attempted to learn. You know, most of the ones that we've talked about have been fairly easy for him. But this is a lesson that David is only partially able to comprehend and really get down inside of him. And it has to do with relationships. How to have proper sexual, social, and family relationships with someone that you can both love and trust. You know, today he's going to be interacting with 4 different people. First of all, there's Saul. And he's going to learn from that authority will betray you and abuse you. From Merab, the best will be taken from you. From Michal, Saul's daughter number 2, that the one that you love will use you. And from Jonathan, he's going to learn about a trusted friend who will love you. Well, let's get started on this, and we have to go back to just as David's going off to battle. As he's going off to battle, he was offered Saul's armor and his sword. David recognized that in that culture, taking that armor and taking that sword would have really been a transfer of authority and a transfer of the kingship. David knew that he was not ready to rule, and so he refused both of them. But what did he do? He took his own armor. Now, his own armor wasn't much. It was a shepherd's garb. It was a sling and 5 stones. Not much at all until you add the most important part of his armor, the name of the Lord. And he told Goliath, he says, you come to me with a sword and a javelin, but I'm going to use my mighty armor on you. I'm going to use my weapon, the name of the Lord. And that brought him victory. Well, when David was on his way to fight Goliath, Saul asked Abner, whose son is that? Abner says, I don't know. Now, it did not mean that neither one of them knew who David was. Of course they did. He'd been in the palace with Saul playing the harp, and Abner, I'm sure, had seen him many times as he came and went. But they did not know his family. And in order for Saul to pay up on the 3rd part of that promised reward, riches, a daughter to be married, and tax exemption for the family, they had to know who David's father was. So Saul says, well, go find out. Well, Abner thought, well, there's no need for me to check now. I'm going to wait and make sure he lives before I do. And sure enough, after the battle, Abner brings David back, carrying the head of Goliath. Ooh. Well, anyway, he brings it back, and he says, whose son are you? And David replies, I am the son of your servant Jesse the Bethlehemite. Well, immediately following that conversation, 2 things happen. First of all, there is a favor that develops between Saul and David and between Jonathan and his son David. And Saul decides, hey, it's going to be best for me, David, if you stay here in the palace so that you're going to be right here with me whenever I need you. That meant that David was no longer allowed to go back to his family and his home in Bethlehem. And along with that came a position in Saul's army. The second thing that happened is David and Jonathan have their first recorded meeting. Now, David had been to the palace a lot of times to play for King Saul. And during that time, Jonathan and David probably did meet. But this is the first time that Scripture actually records a meeting so that we know what it's really like. And here we have that despite their differences and their calling, one of them was the prince, the king's son, the heir apparent. But the second one was one of a lowly shepherd and the unrecognized future king of Israel. But in 1 Samuel 18, verse 3, it says that the soul of Jonathan was knit with the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul, and a covenant was made with them. A lot of times we have problems understanding what this type of friendship really means, but this was not an issue in the ancient culture. They had the most intimate type of friendship and loved each other with a pure love. They had a friendship which could not be affected by time or by circumstances or by any changes that were to happen with them. They had a friendship that exemplified the culture of that day, and one that they would say, friendship produces an entire sameness. It is one soul in two bodies. A friend is another self. What a great way of putting that. Perhaps you can think of a friend that you have. Maybe it's a friend from school, from college, from whatever, that someone you used to work with. You haven't seen them for ages, maybe for years and years. But you are able to just pick right up where you left off, regardless of the time. If you run into each other or you're on texting or whatever, you just stay in touch. Or, maybe you've got the type of friend that you feel like you can't talk to anybody except this one person who really knows you and understands what you're going through. That's the way it was with David and Jonathan. Well, to confirm this covenant, the Bible says that Jonathan took off his robe and his garments and his sword and they called it a girdle, but it was his belt or a sash, and his bow, and he gave it all to David. And when David was offered King Saul's armor and sword, he refused it because he knew that accepting that would be a symbol of him moving into the kingship and taking King Saul's place. But now he's offered the same items from his son Jonathan. And he knew that this was the right time. With accepting Jonathan's sword and his robe, David now became who he was meant to be at this time. He was now the heir apparent, the future king of Israel. Jonathan was a king's son, and he was already an established military leader. And before this, David was just seen as a youth. But now, David became the second in command. This was a role that Saul and Jonathan both recognized happened with the transfer of power, transfer of clothes. And from that moment, Saul called David my son. Even after David and his wife, who was Saul's youngest daughter, were divorced, separated, that's how Saul continued to call him my son. And David only had one title for Saul now, and it was Abba, my father. A new relationship formed between them, one that Jonathan embraced, but Saul fought. Well, at that time, Saul had great favor for David. He loved him. And he sent him out to battle, and everywhere he went, I mean, not only did he defeat Goliath, he became a national hero. And all was well and fine until one day Saul and Jonathan are all on their way into town along with David. And out come the women from all over Israel. And they come out with their tambourines and joy, and they start singing and dancing. And oh, Saul is in his glory. He's probably used to these homecomings. And he hears them sing, Saul is slain his thousands. And oh, he gets happier. And David is tens of thousands. And all of a sudden that balloon was burst. And a hatred for David started to grow. This just demonized him. And with that song, the more he thought about it, he began to wonder, what more can this David have except my kingdom? And that thought ate on him day and night. And he thought the best thing for me to do, the only thing for me to do is to get rid of David. And that became his goal. A goal that followed him throughout the rest of his life. And he took actions to fulfill that. The first time it happened was while David was playing, when everybody knew that this spirit was upon him. Saul picked up a javelin and he threw it at the wall, only not aiming for the wall. He was aiming for David. But the Lord helped David, and David got out of the way in time. Saul realized that he missed. So Saul decided, well, I remember that reward. I think it's time for me to pay up on the third part and give him the third installment. He already has riches. His father's already tax exempt. Now let's see about my daughter. And Saul said to David, here is my older daughter Merab. I will give her to you as a wife. Only be valiant for me and fight the Lord's battles. For Saul thought, not my hand be against him, but let the hand of the Philistines be against him. And he was thinking, if I send him out to enough fights, one of those Philistines is going to get him. Well, there's two problems with this. First of all, David had already won Merab's hand. He did not have to fight for something that was already his. And secondly, the Lord was with David. The Philistines were not able to kill him. And when Saul saw that David survived the Philistines, he gave Merab to another man. 1 Samuel 18:9 says, but when the time came when Merab, Saul's daughter, should have been given to David, she was given to Adriel the Michalite as a wife. Now, Ariel means power, ample, and rich. Now, that sounds like it's pretty good and reasonable for a king's son-in-law, but he was the son of Zillah, meaning iron. During those days, there was no blacksmith in all of Israel because there was no iron. There was no steel. And so what Saul was doing was actually selling his daughter off as a political alliance with Adriel and his family. He could just as easily have given his second daughter, because he did have another daughter that would have formed an alliance with this nation. Saul was a great general, but he was a terrible king and a worse father. God's best for David's wife and life partner was Merab, Saul's eldest daughter. Merab means increase, to cast or to bring together, and to be many more. She was as good as her sister Michal was bad. And Saul recognized her strengths, and he recognized all of her powers, and he wanted to cut off David's lineage. Instead, what happened was Merab went to marry Adriel, and later on, after she died, her 5 sons were killed. Everything that Saul meant to do to David came back on him instead. The Lord said, vengeance is mine. He took care of David. David didn't have to raise a finger. He took care of him. David was betrayed by the one in authority, and he was alone at this time. He had nobody but God. No one spoke up for him and said, Saul, you can't do that. David has already won her. He doesn't have to fight. You have promised her to him. You can't give her to someone else. Jonathan, his son, didn't speak up. The soldiers, the others in Israel who claimed to love him, no one spoke up for him. He was alone. And that's something that many of us have to learn sometimes, that when the one in leadership mistreats you or abuse you, you will often be hurt and alone because others are either afraid to speak up or they do not even recognize that abuse is occurring. That's what happened to David. He was alone. There was nothing he could do and no one who would stand up for him. But what did David do? He goes on. He continues where he is, and he never mentions Merab's name again. He was able to learn and to move on from his hurt and not let it destroy his life. Many times when we're hurt by one in authority, we decide, I'm just not going to have anything else to do with them. They've hurt me. I don't want another thing to do with them. I'm going to get away from them. Might as well leave the church if you can't trust the preacher. No need to trust God. We get our feelings hurt, and so we step out of fellowship, and we lose our place in destiny. But David realized that his calling was greater than his hurt, and he moved on from that. David lost the firstborn daughter, but that still left daughter number 2 with an even greater wedding price. Yeah. Saul says, you can have her if you kill 100 Philistines. You see, Michal, Saul's daughter, loved David. And when the servants told Saul, the thing pleased him. And Saul says, I will give her to him, that she may be a snare to him, and that the hand of the Philistines may be against him. And Paul said to David a second time, you shall be my son-in-law today. Just go out and kill 100 Philistines and bring me back proof. Well, David went out and killed 200 Philistines. But there was a big difference between Merab, the oldest, and Michal, the youngest. It says that Michal loved David. Well, we're not talking about this pure love here. We're talking about the type of love that Jezebel had for Ahab, the type of love that would use him for her destiny, the type of love that she saw one who could be powerful and she wanted more power. And that's what Michal did, and how she tried to use David throughout their time together. Michal actually means a shallow brook, a babbler, to become a snare, a trap, a noose, or a scandal. Now, she became a noose for David, and she certainly caused a scandal later on in their marriage. Michal failed to provide, or actually was incapable of providing, the intimacy, the friendship, and the partnership that David so desperately needed. And this was an area of failure for David throughout his life. We're going to see that he was never able to really have the proper relationship with a woman after this. His family became his weakest part. It was after all of this, and even while it was going on, David was still at the palace, that Jonathan said that he wanted to strengthen his covenant with David. And he added that David would be protected from his father Saul, and asked that David would also protect Jonathan's descendants after David's enemies were destroyed. This was a covenant that just caused that friendship bond to grow stronger and stronger. And even years later, when David is out in the wilderness and he's running from Saul, Jonathan's father, Jonathan tracks him down. And he says, I want to go ahead and renew this covenant. He said, there is a bond between us from God. And Jonathan said, you will escape my father Saul. You shall be king. I'm in line, but you are anointed by God. And my father knows this. Jonathan bowed to God's will even more than he loved his own life. God gave Jonathan, Merab and Michal's brother, as a friend who loved him. One who loved him as he loved his own soul. This was his closest friend and confidant. This is one who knew exactly what Saul did to him. Every action that he took. David told him about it, or he firsthand knew about it. Jonathan gave David what he could not give from Merab because she was taken from him, and what he could not give from Michal because she was incapable of giving. David learned friendship and loyalty with Jonathan. This became one of his strongest points and strongest strengths throughout his life. But he never, ever learned how to have a proper relationship with the opposite sex, how to be honest and genuine with them without being suggestive, flirtatious, or manipulative. And this tore his family apart. Family relationships was the area of failure in David's life, his greatest area of failure. And it's an area that we all need to learn. This is a lesson that every person must come to grips with. We all need to have relationships and find a godly way to meet those needs. It was after David learned this lesson, or at least he attempted to learn it, he had opportunities to learn it, that God moved him on to the next lesson. But because he never fully learned this lesson, it followed him throughout his life. And as we think about our own life and relationships with others, that's still something that is so important. God intended for us to have relationships with other people, whether it's the social relationships, the sexual relationships, the family relationships. They all need to be in order for us to move on to the next place that He has called us to be.